Good evening. Welcome to the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen. It is our great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I'm Karen Taylor, Program Director. This program is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. I would also like to express my appreciation this evening to the New York Landmarks Conservancy for their assistance in promoting this lecture, and to the staff of Rutgers University Press, the publisher of the book. For those of you who this may be your first visit, the General Society was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City. Today, this 230-year-old organization continues to serve the people of the city of New York through its educational, cultural programs. These include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, the General Society Library, which of course you're in at the moment, and our nearly 200-year-old lecture series, of which of course tonight is part of. We have just actually celebrated our 230th anniversary, and in commemoration of this significant event, artisan, sculptor, and General Society member Thomas Donahue transformed our 6 display windows outside to create 6 showstopper vignettes on a celebratory theme. So I hope when you leave this evening, you will have time to enjoy them. They will also evolve over the holiday period, so I also encourage those of you who are perhaps in Midtown to revisit them. The space you're in tonight, as I already referred to, is the Library of the General Society. Founded in 1820, it is the second oldest library in New York City and one of the city's 3 remaining membership libraries. And I also want to mention, for those of you who might be interested in finding out more about membership of the General Society Library, you will find information on library membership at the front table. This evening, we have a very special program. Literary scholar and cultural historian Shelley Fisher Fishkin will be this evening discussing her acclaimed book, Writing America, Literary Landmarks from Walden Pond to Wounded Knee. Published on the eve of the 50th anniversary of the Historic Preservation Act, Writing America is a unique, passionate, and eclectic series of meditations on literature and history, covering over 150 important National Register historic sites. All pivotal stories that make up America, from chapels to battlefields, from plantations to immigration stations, and from theater to internment camps. Professor Fisher Fishkin is the Joseph S. Atha Professor of Humanities. She is also Professor of English and Director of American Studies at Stanford University. She is also the award-winning author, editor, or co-editor of over 40 books and over 100 articles, essays, columns, and reviews. She holds a PhD in American Studies from Yale University and is a former president of American Studies Association. Just before introducing the speaker, I do want to mention, of course, that Writing America will be for sale after the program this evening. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you, and someone who's come a considerable distance to be here this evening, and we so appreciate it, Shelley Fisher Fishkin.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Karen, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to Milena, whoever she is, for all her help in getting things set up this evening. And thank you to all of you for coming. Very pleased you're here. It's a special honor and privilege to be speaking at an institution that has contributed to the cultural vitality of New York for over 2 centuries, especially since I was born in New York. I haven't made New York my home since I was 10. But I always took my pride as a native New Yorker with me, whether I lived in New York or Connecticut or Texas or England or California. So thank you for having me back. E.L. Doctorow once observed that literature endows places with meaning, connecting the visible and the invisible and finding the hidden life in the observable life. But in our current environment of rapid technological and social change, of shortened attention spans, and of the commercial exploitation of every available surface, both American places and American literature are endangered, at risk of being ignored and forgotten, unread or unseen, pulped or bulldozed. But paying more attention to the ways in which public history and literary history intersect can help us appreciate and value both the literature and the landscape more fully. So Writing America focuses on a range of historic sites that have been preserved in enough of their original form to warrant being listed on the National Register. There are some authors' homes, to be sure, including two of my favorites: the home where Walt Whitman was born in Huntington, Long Island, where the future poet caught his first glimpse of that ordinary plant that would inspire his most extraordinary book, Grass, and the dazzling Mark Twain house in Hartford, Connecticut, where Twain lived during the most productive and happy period of his life. But there are also streets, theaters, chapels, schools, docks, plantations, and battlefields, a body of water, a bicycle shop, a ship, graveyards, internment camps, and an irrigation pumping station, all of which helped inspire or serve as the setting for some of the most engaging poetry, fiction, drama, and nonfiction that American writers have produced. In New York City alone, I write about a seaport, apartment houses, a ferry district, a synagogue, a jazz club, a newspaper building, 2 theaters, a tenement, a townhouse, a statue, a library, a factory, and a YMCA. Each site had to provide an opportunity to recall, rethink, or revisit literature that mattered to me. And in that respect, my choices are ultimately very personal ones. There are more than 100 sites in the book, but there might have been many more. And here's one of my favorites that ended up on the cutting room floor, and I'd be happy to talk about it during the question period. Sometimes the links between American literature and National Register sites are clear. So, for example, houses belonging to Harriet Beecher Stowe or Sinclair Lewis are on the register because of their connections with these authors. But the dynamics of placing sites on the register don't always coincide neatly with the dynamics of producing memorable American literature. What about literature produced by writers too poor or too transient to have homes capable of being preserved, such as early 20th century writers who were impoverished workers from Russia or China, or mid-20th century migrant farm workers from the Southwest? Relegated to the margins of American literature for much of the 20th century, writers from these groups are now recognized as important creators of American literature. But they still have no sites on the National Register connected to them, a fact which made this book more challenging than I had expected if I wanted it to reflect the richness and the diversity of the literature that I teach and the literature that I love. So I needed to be creative, pressing into the service of literature sites that were on the register for other reasons. Sites that have been preserved for the history of technology, or architectural history, or Civil War history, or business history, for example, can illuminate chapters of literary history in ways that may never have occurred to the people who worked to put them on the register in the first place. And by the same token, literary figures never associated with a site can shape how we understand what happened there in compelling ways. Teasing out some of the unexpected links between public history and literary history can help us gain fresh perspectives on familiar places and writers. And it can also help us appreciate stories about America that writers and places we may never have met before have to tell. So let me give some examples of this from sites from Texas, North Carolina, and New York. The old irrigation pumping station at Hidalgo, Texas, which was built between 1910 and 1912 as part of the Louisiana-Rio Grande Canal Company irrigation system, pushed up to 250,000 gallons of water per minute from the Rio Grande into irrigation canals that supplied 40,000 acres of farmland in Hidalgo County, Texas, with water, making possible a year-round growing season. As a child, the writer Gloria Anzaldúa picked vegetables in the fields that it irrigated. Later, she chronicled her experience and that of her parents in searing, eloquent poetry and prose in her book, Borderlands La Frontera. It was workers like Anzaldúa and her parents who turned the year-round growing season into wealth that bypassed the people who produced it. Hidalgo County may have been one of the most prosperous agricultural regions in the country in terms of the vegetables and fruits its labor force harvested. But those workers themselves were some of the poorest in the nation. In fact, the year that the book came out, 1987, the county's largest metropolitan area had the lowest per capita income in the country. Anzaldúa wrote, "Sus plumas el viento," her feathers the wind, for her mother, Amalia. Swollen feet, tripping on vines in the heat, palms thick and green-knuckled, sweat drying on top of old sweat, she husks corn, hefts watermelons, bends all the way, digs out strawberries half buried in the dirt. 12 hours later, roped knots cord her back, burlap sack wet around her waist, stained green from leaves and the smears of worms, white heat, no water, no place to pee, the men staring at her ass. Como una mula, she shifts 150 pounds of cotton onto her back, cutting, washing, weighing, packaging, broccoli, spears, carrots, cabbages in 12 hours 15, double shift the roar of machines inside her head. She folds wounded birds, her hands, into the nest, her armpits, looks up at the Texas sky. She vows to get out of the numbing chill, the 110-degree heat. Hidalgo County produced more cabbages, onions, cantaloupes, carrots, and watermelons than any other county in Texas when Anzaldúa published her book. The farm worker in her poem Mar de Repollos, or Sea of Cabbages, is on his knees, hands swollen, sweat flowering on his face, century after century swimming with arthritic arms back and forth, circling, going around and around like a worm in a green sea. At noon, on the edge of the hives of cabbage in the fields of Ranchito in Texas, he takes out his chile wrapped in tortillas, drinks water made hot soup by the sun. Sometimes he curses his luck, the land, the sun. His hands tore cabbages from their nests, ripping the ribbed leaves, covering tender leaves, encasing leaves yet more pale, century after century flailing, unleafing himself in a sea of cabbages. The average lifespan of a Mexican farm laborer, according to Anzaldúa, is 56, but her own father, she tells us, died at 38, having worked himself to death. The pump house is on the National Register for its place in the history of technology, and the complex is also now home to the World Birding Center, run by Texas Parks and Wildlife. But the experience of the workers who were changed by this technology is invisible there. Anzaldúa's moving poetry and prose bring it poignantly alive. If the Hidalgo Pump House was preserved for its place in the history of technology, the Slover Bradham House in Dependency in New Bern, North Carolina, was preserved because it was headquarters of Civil War generals and also because the inventor of Pepsi-Cola later lived there. But I've determined that this site also holds an important if unsung place in American literary history. In 1852, an enslaved woman named Mary Ann Cord was separated from her youngest son, Henry, on the auction block in Richmond and sold to a New Bern merchant named Charles Slover, who put her to work as a cook for a household that by 1861 included his wife, their 8 children, and 10 slaves. Cord's son, Henry, followed the North Star to freedom in 1858 when he was 18 and ended up in Elmira, New York, where a local barber befriended him and taught him his trade. Sometime after the Civil War began, Henry hired himself out as a servant to a commanding officer of one of the many infantry and artillery units that were organized at Elmira, hoping to find his mother as he followed the unit south. When the Black Regiment that he later joined had garrison duty in New Bern, his wish came true. It was in the Slover Dependency that he and his mother were miraculously reunited. He brought her to Elmira, New York after the war, where she became the cook at Quarry Farm, the house where Mark Twain and his family spent summers, and where he wrote his most important works. One evening in the summer of 1874, as the sun set over the Chemung River Valley, Cord told Twain, his wife Olivia, and others assembled on the porch the story of how she was forcibly separated from her youngest son on the auction block and her 7 children, and eventually reunited with her youngest child after the war. Her story made a tremendous impression on Twain, who tells us that he wrote down her words before they were cold. He found Cord's story, quote, a shameful tale of wrong and hardship, but also a curiously strong piece of literary work to come unpremeditated from lips untrained in literary art, end quote. It became the basis for the first piece that Twain published in the Atlantic Monthly, a piece called A True Story, repeated word for word as I heard it. Aunt Rachel, the name that Twain gives Mary Ann Cord in the piece, tells her story with great power and directness in her own words, recorded as Black dialect. It confounded readers and commentators. They expected humor from Twain, and they looked for the joke lurking somewhere. But there was no joke. Instead, there was Black dialect, presented not to be condescended to or ridiculed, but respectfully as a vehicle for communicating raw pain, strong emotion, and harsh truth. As Twain sat on his own front porch, surrounded by his own adored children, this woman brought back to him, in her image of children being wrenched from their mother's arms on the auction block, the agony inflicted by slavery and the enigma of human cruelty, and may have helped trigger memories of other painful scenes Twain had witnessed during his childhood. Mary Ann Cord's grief and despair at being separated from her family, and the language in which she expressed those emotions, would find their way into chapter 23 of Huck Finn, which ends with Jim sitting with his head between his knees, moaning and mourning to himself. Huck tells us, quote, "I knowed what it was about. He was thinking about his wife and his children away up yonder. I do believe he cared as much for his people as white folks does for theirn. It don't seem natural, but I reckon it's so," end quote. Hearing Mary Ann Cord tell her own story in her own words was a key step for Twain on the road to Huck Finn. It was not only that her voice shaped Jim's voice in the novel, it shaped Huck's as well, by making Twain aware of the power of a vernacular narrator. One of the great innovations of Huck Finn was Twain's decision to turn the entire book over to such a speaker, a narrator who didn't use proper grammar, but who kept our attention nonetheless, someone who's really worth listening to. This was something no author had ever done before, and American literature would never be the same. In 2015, there is still no house on the National Register associated with a Jewish American writer. There is a site, on the other hand, right here in New York, preserved for its place in architectural history and social history that helps illuminate the work of a number of Jewish American writers. And their work, in turn, helps make the lives of the people who lived here come vividly alive. No well-known figure lived at 97 Orchard Street. No dramatic events took place there. Indeed, while this obscurity makes it unusual in the roster of American landmarks, that lack of distinctiveness, its typicality, makes it all the more representative of the world it reflects. For 97 Orchard Street is characteristic of buildings that nearly 2 million Jews from Eastern Europe moved into when they arrived in New York between 1881 and 1914, including my own grandparents and great-grandparents. Today, it's the site of the Tenement Museum, a place that provides a window on the world in which these immigrants lived. Jews from Eastern Europe weren't the only residents of 97 Orchard Street, although they were the majority. Between 1873 and 1935, some 10,000 people from more than 20 nations lived in the building. The building's first residents were largely German immigrants. By the 1880s, however, large numbers of Jewish immigrants, mainly from Russia, began moving in, and 20 years later, the residents would be almost entirely Russian-born immigrants and their children. In the spirit of the special status it has as the first American museum devoted to chronicling, interpreting, and commemorating the home and community life of ordinary urban working class and poor immigrants and migrants, the museum sponsors a variety of programs to promote tolerance and to provide historical perspective on immigrant life in Manhattan's Lower East Side. Some immigrants came to avoid the brutal campaign of government-sponsored anti-Semitism against Russia's 5 million Jews after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. Some came to avoid conscription in the Russian army. Some sought a more auspicious economic future. All brought hopes and dreams for a better life in America than they could expect in the old country. In overcrowded apartments, off dark and noisy hallways, often plagued by hunger, disease, and uncertainty about what the New World demanded of them and what it had to offer, these immigrants reinvented themselves as Americans. In the sweatshops of the Lower East Side, they earned their bread. In their synagogues, in their theaters, they pondered which of the old ways would survive here, which ones would not. They fell in love and fell out of love. They were convivial, lonely, confident, and confused. They were plagued by poverty and disease and exploitation and seduced by the promises held out to them. The museum evokes some of the texture of their lives by recreating the spaces in which they moved and the physical objects that they used. But for a window onto their souls and psyches, we must read the novels, plays, poems, and songs that they wrote. As Michael Gold described it in 1930 in his autobiographical novel Jews Without Money, his tenement was nothing but a junk heap of rotten lumber and brick. It was an old ship on its last voyage. In the battering winter storms, all its seams opened, and the wind and snow came through. The plaster was always falling down. The stairs were broken and dirty. 5 times that winter, the water pipes froze, and floods spurted from the plumbing and dripped from the ceilings. There was no drinking water in the tenement for days. The women had to put on their shawls and hunt in the street for water. The poverty, the overcrowding, the lack of privacy, the primitive plumbing, the decaying, overburdened structures shaped the imaginations of the writers the tenements produced, as did their dreams, their sense of possibility, and their perplexity at the puzzle of a society that promised so much but that often delivered so little. Gold recalled a pressing question of his childhood. Did God make bedbugs? One steaming hot night, I couldn't sleep for the bedbugs. They have a peculiar nauseating smell of their own. It is the smell of poverty. They crawl slowly and pompously, bloated with blood, and the touch and smell of these parasites wakens every nerve to disgust. He wasn't any lack of cleanliness in his home, Gold adds. His mother worked herself to the bone, keeping us fresh and neat. The bedbugs were a torment to her. She doused the beds with kerosene, changed the sheets, sprayed the mattresses in an endless, frantic war with bedbugs. What was the use? Nothing could help. It was poverty. It was the tenement. The bedbugs lived and bred in the rotten walls of the tenement with the rats, fleas, roaches. The whole rotten structure needed to be torn down. A kerosene bottle would not help. It had been a frightful week of summer heat. I was sick and feverish with heat and pitched and tossed while the cats sobbed in the yard. The bugs finally woke me. They were everywhere. I cannot tell the despair, loathing, and rage of the child in the dark tenement room as they crawled on me and stank. I cried softly. My mother woke and lit the gas. She renewed her futile battle with the bedbugs. The kerosene smell choked me. My mother tried to soothe me back to sleep, but my brain raced like a sewing machine. Mama, I asked, why did God make bedbugs? She laughed at a little boy's quaint question. I was often jollied about it later, but who has answered this question? Did the God of love create bedbugs? Did he also put pain and poverty in the world? At the turn of the century, the walls of 97 Orchard Street reverberated with jokes and shouts and wails and imprecations and exclamations in Yiddish, the language spoken by virtually all of the Jews who came from Eastern Europe. Some of the writers who came out of this milieu in the early 20th century, like the poet Morris Rosenfeld, wrote American literature in Yiddish. Rosenfeld, who worked long hours in a sweatshop all day, wrote poetry at night about the sweatshop and the toll that it took on his family life. His most famous poem is probably the poignant Mein Jingele, or My Little Son, about a father who just adores his little son, but whose hours in the sweatshop allow him to see the child only when he's fast asleep. And here are 3 stanzas of the poem translated by Aaron Kramer. But seldom do I see him when he's wide awake and bright. I always find him sound asleep. I see him late at night. The time clock drags me off at dawn. At night it lets me go. I scarcely know my flesh and blood. His eyes I hardly know. I climb the staircase wearily, a figure wrapped in shade. Each night my haggard wife describes how well the youngster played. And subsequent verses depict the father's sadness at not being able to see his child begin to talk, at not being able to look into his eyes when he's awake. And it ends with a thought that the father cannot bear. One morning when you wake, my child, you'll find that I'm not there. The poem is all the more heartrending given the fact that the son that the poet longs to see during waking hours in the poem himself died at age 15 in 1905. Rosenfeld was a hugely popular poet on the Lower East Side, where his poems were recited in tenements and sweatshops and at workers' gatherings. And he even reached a much wider audience when his poems were translated into English, German, and eventually many other languages, including Japanese. Excuse me. Sometimes a place helped nurture directly the creation of American fiction and poetry. That's certainly the case with the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library, now the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. In the 1920s, the library was a hub of cultural vitality and a welcoming place to work for writers, like Nella Larson, who was herself a librarian there before coming into her own as a leading writer in the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes met County Cullen there in 1922 when both were 20 years old. Hughes was at work as a seaman on a ship docked at Jones Point, New York, when a poetry reading at the library was organized at which Cullen was to be featured. Cullen offered to perform some of Hughes' poems for him. As Arnold Rampersad notes, Hughes took him up on it, sending along syllabic poem, a poem with no words in it that poked fun at the pretentiousness of poetry readings. Hughes asked Cullen to, quote, tell them that it is the poetry of sound, pure sound, and that it marks the beginning of an era of revolt against the trite and outworn language of the understandable. Wouldn't that be amusing? End quote. Hughes' poetry would have an impact on the library's physical space nearly 7 decades after Cullen read that nonsense poem. Hughes' poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, inspired an art installation titled Rivers by sculptor Houston Conwell that now dominates the floor of the lobby entrance to the library's auditorium. Beneath the brass floor medallion, which was completed in 1991 and features quotations from Hughes' famous poem, Langston Hughes' ashes are permanently interred. Sometimes a place owes its preservation to the literature that helped teach us to value it. John Muir, for example, who did so much to ensure that future generations would be able to see what he saw at Yosemite and other sites of natural beauty, and whose work laid the foundation for the creation of the National Park Service, drew much of his inspiration from early readings of Henry David Thoreau's Walden and the essays of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And it was the discovery of Chinese poems carved on the walls of the immigration station at Angel Island in San Francisco Bay that helped jumpstart efforts to preserve that site and to memorialize what happened there. If literature has played a role in teaching us to value parts of the physical world can play a role in helping us understand aspects of literature. I was unprepared for some of the lessons that architecture had to teach me about the literary past. For example, the melange of Spanish, Mexican, Anglo, and German architectural elements in buildings in the lower Rio Grande Valley is a perfect metaphor for the cultural hybridity that is such a central theme to poetry and fiction produced there, and that is at the core not only of novels like Caballero by Jovita Gonzalez and George Washington Gomez by Amerigo Paredes, but also at the heart of Gloria Anzaldua's most famous poem, in which she writes that to live in the borderlands means to put chili in the borscht, eat whole wheat tortillas, speak Tex-Mex with a Brooklyn accent, be stopped by La Migra at border checkpoints. Or consider the outrageously gaudy Chinese theater on Hollywood Boulevard. Excuse me, inspired not by anything one might actually find in China, but by images of Chinese-influenced Chippendale design that the architects clipped from Connoisseur magazine. Hollywood's extravagant fantasy architecture helped me appreciate the psychology of Monroe Starr, the protagonist of F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Last Tycoon, who was based on the MGM producer Irving Thalberg, whose autocratic autonomy intrigued and fascinated Fitzgerald. Just as the architects of Hollywood's theaters indulged in fantasies about nations and cultures, Hollywood's producers would create any climate and any terrain, would commandeer any army to storm any target at will. When told that he couldn't have a moonlit seaside scene in a film supposedly set in Paris, Thalberg replied, "We can't cater to a handful of people who know Paris." I was also struck by the ways in which the exotic architecture along Hollywood Boulevard, that cavalierly made all the cultures of the world its own, reflected the tendency of so many films made there to turn ethnic and racial others into stereotyped creatures of the imagination as far from real people as Grumman's theater was from China. A tendency, or as far as the Egyptian theater was from Egypt, a tendency that inspired writers from some of those ethnic and racial groups, like David Bradley and Tino Villanueva, to set the record straight with poetry and fiction of their own. I found myself learning surprising lessons from artifacts as well as architecture as I wrote this book. I hadn't expected to gain new insight into the racial politics of Paul Laurence Dunbar's poetry from a distinctive piece of furniture that his mother kept in the home he purchased for the two of them in Dayton, Ohio. The delicate china platters and electric chandelier in Matilda Dunbar's dining room reflected the solid middle-class comfort her favorite son had earned through his writing. But across the back wall of the dining room was a distinctive piece of furniture that recalled Matilda Dunbar's roots in slavery. It's called a mammy's bench. She had appreciated the ingeniousness of the long rocking bench with the removable gate across half its length as she juggled household tasks, her work as a laundress, and the challenge of minding young Paul and his baby sister. The clever piece of furniture allowed a mother to rock her baby safely in the gated section while having room on the other half of the bench for herself and things she needed to do, shell peas, fold laundry, etc. Matilda had been introduced to a bench like this as part of her work as a house slave in Shelbyville, Kentucky. There were no more babies in the house by the time she moved into Summit Street in Dayton in 1903. But that didn't stop her from keeping in a prominent place this big, bulky reminder of her slave past. Her talented son grew up listening to stories of family members and friends, many of whom, like his parents, had been raised in slavery. And some of those stories of slavery and voices of slaves got into his poetry. This led some black critics, decades after his death, to charge him with emulating the commercially successful but politically suspect white plantation tradition authors to woo a white readership. Writers who painted nostalgic scenes of loyal slaves with no lives of their own to live, who lived to serve their masters, their beloved masters. But the Mammy's bench suggested a different way of looking at Dunbar's dialect poetry set in slavery. Slaves in Dunbar's dialect poems set on the plantation, are vibrant and alive individuals with likes and dislikes, energy, agency, and special talents. Can we blame Dunbar for not wanting to cede to white authors, propping up the plantation tradition, the right to write about the complexity of his parents' lives and those of their friends? Ultimately, in his most memorable dialect poems, and these include, I think, some of the greatest poems by an American, Dunbar is doing something much more subversive than imitating white plantation tradition writers of his day. He's celebrating the genius and beauty of his people, which is a radical act in a society in which every day, in dozens of subtle and unsubtle ways, declares them stupid and ugly. Like his mother, he knew that not everything from the slave past deserved to be forgotten. Alongside the pain and humiliation, there was occasionally something worth savoring or saving, like melodies, moments of laughter, and ingenious furniture for minding babies. Our nation is filled with historic sites associated with episodes of tragedy and trauma. Literature can vividly evoke what the site meant to people who experienced those events at the time, and can help us continue to come to terms with the past as a nation. Excuse me. Whitman's stark and powerful description of Union prisoners released at Andersonville leaves horrific, indelible images in our mind. Dunbar's artful poems in both standard English and dialect about the black soldiers who fought at Fort Pillow and Olustee and elsewhere make their experiences and those of their grieving loved ones come poignantly alive. Maxine Hong Kingston's moving book Chinamen and Jenny Lim's play Paper Angels evoke the trauma of the seemingly interminable limbo that Chinese immigrants endured at Angel Island and the fears that accompanied their often stressful interrogations. They also convey the sense of humor and bonds of community that helped them survive. Mineo Kubo's pioneering graphic novel, Citizen 13660, brings to life what Japanese-American families like her own experienced as they were rounded up and sent to relocation centers. And in his poem, Concentration Constellation, in Legends from Camp, Lawrence Fasawi Nada reminds us of the location of each of the 10 internment camps and then connects the dots, if you will, to reveal a riveting image of this shameful chapter of the past, a jagged scar, massive, on the massive landscape. It lies there like a rusted wire of a twisted and remembered fence. To glimpse the lives of the Jewish and Italian immigrants who perished in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, we can read poems by Morris Rosenfeld, like The Sweatshop. So wild is the roar of machines in the sweatshop, I often forget I'm alive in that din. I'm drowned in the tide of the terrible tumult. My ego is slain. I become a machine. I work and I work without rhyme, without reason, produce and produce and produce without end. For what and for whom? I don't know. I don't wonder. Since when could a whirling machine comprehend? We can learn what happened at Wounded Knee, South Dakota on December 29, 1890, from accounts of witnesses like Nicholas Black Elk and Charles Eastman. But contemporary Native American poet Wendy Rose thrusts us brutally into the excruciating pain of lives not only cut short violently, but violated again in death. She begins her poem, I Expected My Skin and My Blood to Ripen, in her book Bone Dance, with an extract from an auction catalog, advertising items plundered from dead Indians at Wounded Knee. The catalog extract in the poem that follows, in which the poet enters the mind of a woman killed in the massacre, makes clear the poet's view that Indian art and artifacts get more respect than the Indians themselves did. I expected my skin and my blood to ripen, not to be ripped from my bones. Fallen fruit, I am peeled, tasted, discarded. My seeds open and have no future. Now there has been no past. My feet were frozen to the leather, pried apart, left behind, bits of flesh on the moccasins, bits of paper deer hide on the bones. My back was stripped of its cover, its quilling intact, taken away. My leggings were taken like in a rape and shriveled to the size of stick figures, like they had never felt the push of my strong woman's body walking in the hills. A community's sense of identity, its aspirations and its insecurities, all help determine what neighborhoods, buildings, and spaces get targeted for preservation, and the stories that get told about them. Similar factors shape not only which writers achieve canonical status at any given point, but also which of their works become canonical as well. The town of Hannibal, Missouri, for example, is into historic preservation in a big way. Virtually the entire economy of the town runs on Twain tourism. But when I first went there in 1995, the only evidence I could find in the Mark Twain Historic District that Hannibal had been a slaveholding town were two tiny ads for runaway slaves from a newspaper in 1849 in a display case in the Mark Twain Boyhood Home. At a show presented at the Mark Twain Outdoor Theater at Clemens Landing that promised to bring to life in a very special way scenes from Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, and life on the Mississippi, there was no Jim, no black actor in the entire cast, and no reference to the fact that slavery had been a prominent institution in both Hannibal and the fictionalized version of it in Twain's novel, in Twain's life and work and in his novels. While the Mark Twain Historic District erased the black presence in Twain's life and works, the town also erased all signs of the bustling black-owned businesses that had thrived in segregated Hannibal during the decades after Twain's death. The self-appointed guardians of Twain's legacy in Hannibal valued the Twain who wrote Tom Sawyer more than the Twain who penned searing critiques of his hometown after he left. They saw no value in honoring the memory of the Twain whose merciless satires skewered the hypocrisy of a democracy founded by slaveholders on principles of individual liberty. In Hannibal, as in many places in the country, slavery and segregation may be gone, but the persistence of the racism that allowed both to flourish still makes presenting certain chapters of the past particularly difficult. It strikes many as simpler and safer to just forget the whole thing. Hannibal may have been keen about historic preservation, but the history that it wanted to preserve was of little boys who played marbles, not of little boys sold away from their mothers on the corner of Center and 3rd Street. I had made Hannibal's willingness to exploit its connection to Twain, while burying both his writings and the world in which he lived under a barrage of kitsch nostalgic fantasies, central to my 1997 book, Lighting Out for the Territory. And after the book came out, a progressive local attorney named Terrell Dempsey, prompted in part by reading the book, decided to find out what he could about the history of slavery in Hannibal. And he published a groundbreaking volume in 2003 called Searching for Jim, Slavery in Sam Clemens' World. This was a book that was rich with recovered archival materials and that offered a host of new opportunities to tell Hannibal's stories in fresh ways. But neither the town nor the boyhood home was quite ready to seize those opportunities. The same year that Dempsey's book came out, Black Hannibal residents erected a granite marker commemorating a significant chapter of Hannibal's past that no longer existed. The 23 once thriving black-owned businesses that had been located on the Broadway side of Wedge between 1920 and 1984. The handsome memorial, adjacent to the Save-A-Lot parking lot on North Broadway, features the names of long-gone barber shops, beauty shops, taverns, taxi companies, social clubs, fraternal organizations, funeral homes, nightclubs, a grocery store, a doctor's office, a printing company, all testimony to the existence of a community with roots in slavery that had survived and thrived despite discrimination and exclusion. But as soon as the monument was in place, some white Hannibal residents waged a protest. What about the white businesses in the area that were no longer there? They erected their own counter-monument across the street, a curiously cryptic little marker, dedicated to the memory of the businesses of the Wedge and Market Street area, 2003. As late as 2004, some board members of the Mark Twain Boyhood Home still loudly complained that the Boyhood Home should not be tainted by the story of slavery. But in 2005, they were overruled, in part in response to my criticisms of Hannibal, which were increasingly echoed by others. Several panels addressing Twain's experience with slavery in Hannibal appeared for the first time in the museum's interpretive center. That cost the museum the goodwill of its largest donor. The Boyhood Home's decision to acknowledge the existing of slavery in Hannibal is important. But the panels have a hermetically sealed quality to them that distorts not only Hannibal's history, but also the achievement of its most famous native son. Because the target of Twain's satire in Huck Finn in 1885 was not slavery, which had been gone for 2 decades, but racism. The racism that had allowed respectable citizens to be blind to what was morally indefensible about buying and selling human beings, and that allowed those same people to effectively re-enslave the ex-slaves in the 1880s by snatching away from them the hard-won rights they had been granted during Reconstruction. In 2011, community historian Faye Dant began collecting photographs, clippings, directories, furniture, clothing, and other artifacts depicting African-American life in Hannibal from slavery through the 1950s for an exhibit she curated at the Hannibal History Museum in downtown Hannibal. Excuse me. Over the next 2 years, she gathered additional materials from the town's Black residents and worked to gain support from the Marion County Historical Society, the Missouri Humanities Council, the Hannibal City Council, and Hannibal's mayor. Her efforts culminated in 2013 with the grand opening of a new museum in town, Jim's Journey, the Huck Finn Freedom Center. And it's now the first building that visitors encounter when they turn off the highway en route to the Mark Twain Historic District. Its home is the old Welshman's house, a one-room stone structure thought to have been built by slaves in 1839, a building that figures in a key scene in Tom Sawyer. And indeed, the Marion County Historical Society saved the building from demolition and moved it from its original location a few blocks away to its current address. Dant claims to have been inspired by my books Lighting Out for the Territory and Was Huck Black, Mark Twain and African American Voices, by my condemnation of Hannibal's failure to acknowledge its slave past and its erasure of those slaves' descendants, by my analysis of key roles African Americans had played in shaping Twain's work, and my description of Twain's efforts to oppose racism through his writing and through his actions. She was determined that the new museum rescue and preserve for future generations both the history that the town had ignored and these neglected aspects of Mark Twain. During the Civil War, the Welshman's house had been used by Union troops to store munitions. The new museum contained materials that were pretty combustible in their own right, stark emblems of a past the town had tried to bury. Jim Crow-era signs like colored waiting room nestle against the medals and citations testifying to what the town's Black residents had achieved despite obstacles thrown in their way. There are scores of photos of the small, proud Douglass School, the segregated Douglass School, which gave generations of Hannibal's Black children the skills to make their way in a white-run world that assumed they'd never amount to very much. Students who attended Douglass School became accomplished teachers, doctors, lawyers, talented musicians and athletes, successful businessmen, and committed public servants, such as Lieutenant General Donald Scott, who would become Deputy Librarian and Chief Operating Officer of the Library of Congress. General Scott and Faye Dant's husband, Joel Dant, both officers of the new museum, are both great-grandsons of a Missouri slave named Henry Dant, born the same year Sam Clemens was born, about 15 miles away from Clemens' Florida, Missouri birthplace. The frame sign that greets visitors when they enter Jim's Journey reads, "In order to live in the present and prepare for the future, we must first understand the past. Welcome." Outside, a very different sign towers over the small stone building that houses the museum. A huge billboard erected by the Hannibal Visitors Bureau located next door. "Welcome to historic Hannibal. Write your own story." While the story that the new museum tells is a story in which slavery figures prominently, it does not end with slavery. It's the story of the racism that persisted long after slavery ended and that persists still, a story that became increasingly important to Mark Twain himself and that unfortunately continues to be all too relevant to a nation and world that still has trouble coming to terms with issues of race. But that's a story that Hannibal still prefers to bury. America's hometown is still mainly ruled by Tom Sawyer and is kept gleaming with gallons of whitewash. Despite the fact that the new museum is less than 4 blocks from the Mark Twain Boyhood Home, the staff of the Boyhood Home failed to mention it when teachers across the country arrived for a workshop on teaching Huck Finn in the fall of 2014. And despite numerous pleas, the sightseeing tours of historic Hannibal that the Hannibal Trolley Company offers visitors every day during the tourist season drive right past the museum and fail to mention it. And just to make sure that this information wasn't out of date, I checked with Faye Dant this week, and both of these facts still hold. When we go to these sites today, we can still encounter some of the tensions reflected in what these writers wrote about them. The racism exposed and condemned by Mark Twain, Paul Laurence Dunbar, and Gloria Anzaldúa has still not been eradicated. One can grasp more fully the roots of these writers' frustration and despair in visits to locales that shaped their art. In Hannibal, Missouri, which still largely erases the place of slavery in its past and downplays Twain's role as an anti-racist writer. In Dayton, Ohio, which instead of celebrating the interracial adolescent friendship of Paul Laurence Dunbar and the Wright brothers, ignores it almost entirely. And in the Rio Grande Valley, where the disregard for Mexican farm workers' health and well-being that cut short the life of Gloria Anzaldúa's father continues to curtail the life expectancies of people who pick the fruit and vegetables for our dinner table. Visits to historic sites today can help us think about questions that are as unresolved today as they were when these writers wrote about them. A trip to the Angel Island Immigration Station, or Hannibal, Missouri, or Wounded Knee, or the original Main Street, or the Roma Historic District, or Manzanar, can help us think about questions like, who is an American? What is an American? What unites us? What divides us? Who and what are still left out of the nation's narratives of who and what we are and where we come from? What counter-narratives are suppressed in public spaces? Who gets to tell our public stories? Whose voices get silenced? Who gets heard? Physical places and imaginative terrains can reflect and refract each other in ways that cast unexpected lights and shadows on the alchemy by which American writers have transformed the world around them, changing their world and ours in the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shelley. We'll just take a few questions now. Anyone is...
Yes.
What made you finally decide on the parts of the country and the books, some of the books that you chose? Because there are countless.
Right.
You could have spoken about.
And really there was this, yeah, certainly. So the question was, how did I decide on the parts of the country and the sites that I particularly wrote about? So ultimately the choices were very personal, and I was going to say it began with the literature, but actually it began with the sites. I mean, my entire career was changed by my mother taking me to Mark Twain's home in Hartford when I was 10. And that was where I first became fascinated by this writer, and I realized that these sites, which we're fortunate enough to have preserved, can actually really change the way people understand the literature. And similarly, going to Paul Laurence Dunbar's home in Dayton really made me decide that he was totally underappreciated, under-recognized, and I ended up having the centennial, getting the centennial conference at his death at Stanford, and that led to an edition of the journal African American Review. I forget the name changed, but anyway, a particular journalist who devoted, I edited a book of his work. So the places can spark an interest in literature, but ultimately I had to love literature that the places could illuminate. So I was looking for sites that would allow me to write about Chicano literature on the border, because I felt that this literature was really important. It was American literature. It was great American literature. Books like George Washington Gomez, Gloria Anzaldúa's work. This was all very important. Tomas Rivera's work. That I really wanted people to appreciate the beauty of the literature, and therefore I was looking for places that could support that. I also wanted to have some geographic reach, and I wanted to have some different kinds of sites. So sites that also that had really ambivalent, complicated roles in their community, like the original Main Street, which initially horrified, residents of Sauk Center were initially horrified when Sinclair Lewis's book came out. It was a devastating picture of their community. But then all of a sudden, strange things happen, and they realized, my gosh, we're the original Main Street, and this has gotten prizes, and this has gotten fame, and they kind of forgot what he wrote and decided to celebrate the fact that they were the model for his book. And so they don't necessarily teach his books in the schools, but they have, parades honoring him. They've renamed the Main Street, the original Main Street. So they capitalize on that connection. But also I think that there are places which I just found intriguing, like the Hollywood Boulevard Historic District was an opportunity to look at the relationship between American writers and Hollywood, which is very, very complicated, very vexed. Hollywood has given immortality to the works of some American writers. It has also completely savaged those works in their adaptations of them. And then what also intrigued me was the ways in which it inspired writers to talk back to Hollywood. So literally David Bradley became a writer because he was so angered by the film Birth of a Nation. And he writes about that in a wonderful book called The Movie That Changed My Life. So that interested me too. So, ultimately I had the freedom to write about what I wanted to write about, but I decided to only include places that were on the National Register of Historic Places or state registers because they had more of a chance of sticking around. There was more of a chance that people reading this book a generation from now would be able to encounter those places. No guarantee. In other words, being on the register only provides certain kinds of protections, as I'm sure many of you in this room know, but it was a little bit of more of a chance that it would be around. And I apologize if there are some favorite sites and favorite authors of yours in this room that did not get into the book, but I did have many more, but my publisher made me cut about a third of them, and they were right. It would have been a much longer book, and it would have been really unwieldy. Rutgers has been great, by the way. It's been really wonderful. Yes?
And what is your story about the Lyceum Theater?
Oh, well, okay. So the Lyceum Theater has a wonderful connection to Mark Twain, not only because he attended plays there. He was a big fan of the actor Billy Burke, who we know as Glenda, the Good Witch in The Wizard of Oz, but in her young, as a young actress, she was in stage plays in the Lyceum. But Twain himself wrote a play in 1898 in Vienna, which he was convinced was about to be produced in London and New York. He leaked to the press it was going to be produced in London and New York. It was not. For a series of reasons, it was never produced in his lifetime. I came across it in the Mark Twain archives of the Bancroft Library around 2002 or so, and I got very excited. I was giggling in the archives, and I just said, this is too good to just leave accumulating dust. And so I ended up publishing it, and then it was something I really wanted to get produced. And it ended up being produced on Broadway in the Lyceum Theater, directed by Michael Blakemore, adapted by David Ives. And so that was the theater where Twain not only had been a riveted patron, really enjoying watching plays, but it was the theater that brought his play to Broadway, a play that he loved and that he was very frustrated about. So that was a great adventure. It was really fun. Thank you for asking. Sorry, it was called Is He Dead? And it's a really hilarious play. It's actually had a great life. It may be playing in a community near you. If you want to find out, go to the website playscripts.com and just put in Is He Dead or put in Mark Twain, and it tells you where all the productions are scheduled in the future. There have been something like 350 productions of it since it closed on Broadway. It had a wonderful run on Broadway, wonderful in terms of great acclaim, but its first preview was the same night as the stagehand strike. And that really was another stroke of bad luck. So it didn't have as long a run as it should have had on Broadway because of that. But it's been in lots of different theaters around the country, I think all states but 5 and 8 or 9 different countries. So Is He Dead? If you get a chance to see it, it's really, very funny. Yes?
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, and
Thank you.
I look forward to reading the book. You began by pointing out that we were in the midst of a great economic evolution in the preservation of these sites, and had lost our sense of place, and that you could connect them to the literature. But I wonder, as you wrote this, we're in the city that saved the landmark preservation movement, and the National Register became increasingly important for saving the prosaic as well as the famous, and giving us these insights into ways of living. And what did you come away with thinking about the National Register itself? it's a very conflicted effort. It's still evolving. And what thoughts do you have about where landmarking should go?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And that's a really interesting question. In part, because I was thinking about questions like that, I went to the Past Forward National Preservation Conference 2 weeks ago in Washington, D.C., which was sort of the launch of the celebration of 2016, which is the 50th anniversary of the Historic Preservation Act. And what was fascinating is that the folks who are involved in the National Register itself are really thinking through these questions, and everything is up for grabs. And they really are interested in figuring out whether the current guidelines for what it takes to be on the National Register need to be revised. And it was interesting, the head of the National Register in one of the sessions had to remind everyone in the room, these are guidelines, they're not strict rules, because very often, I mean, they have things like integrity, which means something has to have enough architectural original materials to warrant being included. And there was questions whether there are certain other kinds of terms like authenticity or meaning, that a structure can have meaning to a community even if the original building materials are not still a part of the building. And then there are also, people raised questions about sites which are currently a part of the cultural observations of an ongoing community in a place, where it's not so much preserving as conserving and allowing these activities to continue. So I think that that they do need to be expanded. I mean, on the one hand, most things have architectural reasons for being on the register. I would say the preponderance of sites on the register do preserve architecture in key ways. And that's not a bad thing, as I learned. I mean, it's great that they're there, but I think it's also really important to expand that. And so, for example, I went to, there's so many new ways that this could happen. I went to a meeting of the Asian American Pacific Islander caucus of the Preservation Conference, and they are encouraging Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, wherever they are, to take photographs of sites that are important to them and their community, and to put them onto a website through HistoryPin. HistoryPin, I don't know if you've come across it. It's a free platform developed in England that anyone can use. It's easy to use, and you can upload a photo and put it on a map. And so they want to have a map of thousands of places, that are meaningful to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, so that when coming up with trails, National Historic Trails, or new landmark designations is on the agenda, there'll be lots of places to choose from and lots of opportunities. But I think it's not at all clear, what makes a landmark. Some places are landmarks, even some places that are in my book, where the entire structure is absent, but the place is still so meaningful. So, for example, there's a monument in Concord Square in Concord, Massachusetts, where the jail where Henry David Thoreau spent a night, and that the essay on civil disobedience came out of. And that's so important, that site, even though it's an absence, it just says it was here, that's still there. I'm really glad the monument is there. On the other hand, they're sites that are not on the register and may not be preserved, and maybe some of these, the new ferment over what it takes will help encourage people to try to preserve other sites. What are your thoughts about that question?
Well, I agree, it's evolving, and I think it's a very exciting thing to attach the literary world to a place. I think place-based preservation is increasingly important, and I was thinking as you were talking about literature and writing about places that we conserve where, for instance, the American development of art evolved, whether it's the Impressionists in Connecticut or the Hudson River School of Painting just north of where we are today. I mean, these are places that are understood through the medium of understanding that painting and art and the visual attaches to a sense of place too, and there are art trails and things now that have emerged which are as important as the physical landmark of a building, and we don't yet have a way to capture that effectively in either a national register or in a conservation process like landmarking.
Well, I predict that this current generation that is so digitally talented are going to figure out ways to make virtual historic trails that will be a lot richer and a lot more complex than any of the physical trails that we have right now. Yeah.
Your work, in Venn diagram terms, there's considerable overlap with a lot of stuff that's been done in the last 30, 40 years by radical historians, American historians, which are various types, by the guy who wrote Lies My Teacher Told Me about historical monuments around the... Seems to be a parallel to yours, and there are movements that we've had in New York and elsewhere where sort of guerrilla historians go up and put their own plaques to identify things, and that overlaps into struggles like the preservations of the African burial ground here in Lower Manhattan and so on. And what I was wondering is, how do you see your work, which is, part of your overall, the work that you've done with your life's work, but it's a particular individual approach to this, and so are some of these other things. How can they be brought into sync to sort of create a deeper, richer understanding of history in place than we currently have?
What a great question. Thank you. I don't have a really good answer to that, but I think that part of what I'm doing in a book like this is, in some ways it's a Trojan horse, because by getting people who are interested in the literature or the place or both, I want to prompt them to think about the history that shaped both. And my work has certainly been shaped by the traditions that you're talking about. And I think that Lowen's, Lies My Teacher Told Me, and also Lies Across America about landscape and historic stuff. Yeah, and I think that we're very much kindred spirits. And actually, we both recognize that. We've met each other, and we kind of appreciate that. I think that literature can really bring history alive, and foregrounding a lot of the literature that I choose to foreground in this book specifically engages stories that a lot of these historians are focused on, more so than stories that might have, interested a different generation or a different kind of historian. So I think I view them as kind of parallel tracks. Thank you. Yes.
This may be a bit of a tangent, but when you talk about the designating of landmarks, and in New York, I don't know if I have to press this. Do you hear me?
Yes.
And the sad thing is that a lot of these landmarks are disappearing. When you think of the Art Students League that was designated as a landmark, we're going to have the tallest building in the city cantilevered over it. When you think of Central Park as the jewel in the crown, and 11 90-story buildings on 57th Street creating shadows going up to 72nd Street, keeping the park in darkness in the winter months. It is something I feel that I'd love everyone to be aware of and speak up about, but it sort of brought that to mind when I thought in terms of hearing you talk about some of the landmarks.
Well, it's a constant negotiation. I mean, I think that, change is part of life, but also continuity is part of life, and figuring out the balance between the two is something that each community needs to work out on its own. And they're very, they're different groups' needs that need to be balanced against each other. But yeah, they're really tough challenges. Is there another question? Thank you very much. You've been a really great audience, really great questions. I enjoyed them. Thank you.
So I would like to, on behalf of the General Society, first of all, thank Shelley so much for her wonderful eloquent and very thought-provoking presentation. I think we could be here all night talking about the definition of a landmark, but you know what? I already feel that Writing America 2, there's going to be, I have a feeling, and I know your publisher's here, I feel there will be certainly an opportunity for that. First, so Shelley, on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, our Executive Director, Victoria Dangle.
Yes, would like to present you with a plaque to express our gratitude to you for Shelley Fisher Fishkin, for Writing America, Literary Landmarks from Walden Pond to Wounded Knee, for your participation in the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. You joined close to 200 years of lectures, and Karen can name some of our more prominent lecturers. That Ralph Waldo Emerson spoke here, and I mean the list goes on. And as I listened to you, Shelley, and Tom Wolfe did his work here, and I mean again,
George Plimpton,
yes,
E.L. Doctorow.
Yes. It goes on, and we've been welcoming readers to our space since 1820, and specifically in this building since 1903. And I just want to say we're in a room that, thanks to Andrew Carnegie giving us money in 1903, we were able to build this beautiful space, which used to be an open courtyard. This building, too, is on the National Register of Historic Places, so when you do Writing America 2, I do hope you'll include us. No pressure. And to seal that deal, Shelley Fisher Fishkin, we're making you a member of our library.
Yeah. So you'll have to come back, right? Right.
Right in this space, and we'd love to welcome you back. And we thank each and every one of you who have come tonight to support and participate in the lecture, and we hope that you'll be joining us for future lectures. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, that's good. Thank you. This is wonderful.
And
I'm so excited.
so,
Thank you.
congratulations. So we're delighted to give you this citation, and Meg Stanton would like a little memento of the evening. In conclusion, I would like to thank Shelley again so much. We're really honored to have you speak this evening. And of course, very importantly, I do want to remind you that this book is now for sale, and I believe that Shelley would be willing to autograph it. So I hope you will now join us for a glass of wine. Thank you so much again for coming. We wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.